Welcome to Morpheus Nights. Find a comfortable place, let your shoulders relax, and allow the noise of the day to slowly fade away. Tonight, we will travel into a quiet story, a place of gentle winds, distant forests, and soft winter skies. You don't need to imagine everything perfectly. Just listen, breathe slowly, and let the story carry you wherever your dreams wish to go. When you are ready, close your eyes and let the night begin. Part 1. The Garden Above the Rooftops. In the oldest quarter of a northern city, where the chimneys leaned together like old friends and the snow liked to gather in the corners of every roof, there stood two narrow houses with windows so close that in summer, one could almost pass a flower pot from one sill to the other. Between those windows, high above the street, and the restless wheels of carts below, there was a small garden made not of earth, but of wooden boxes, clay bowls, and patient hands. In that little hanging garden grew mint, ivy, pale bluebells, and winter roses that bloomed later than anyone expected. The garden belonged equally to two children, though neither of them had ever spoken of ownership. One was a girl named Elin, quiet-eyed and thoughtful, with a voice that always seemed softer than the room around her. The other was Rowan, a boy with quick laughter, wind-reddened cheeks, and a habit of asking questions nobody else thought to ask. When they were younger, they believed the garden floated. On certain misty mornings, when the bells of the distant cathedral sounded through the fog and the rooftops faded into pearl-colored clouds, it truly seemed possible that their flowers were sailing through the sky while the city slept below. "It's a ship," Rowan had once said, kneeling beside a box of rosemary dusted with frost. "And we are the only two aboard." Elin, who had been wrapping a strip of cloth around a cracked pot to keep it from splitting further in the cold, had looked up and smiled. "Then we should be careful not to sink it." That was the sort of thing she often said, simple and serious, as if every small matter in the world deserved tenderness. The winters in their city were long and full of blue light. Snow did not fall there in a hurry. It drifted slowly, thoughtfully, as though it had all the time in the world. On those evenings, Rowan and Elin sat by their facing windows with blankets over their knees, watching the white hush gather on the roofs and rails. They told each other stories then. Not loud, adventurous stories of kings or battles, but wandering ones, about sleeping forests, silver rivers under ice, and birds that remembered the road to summer even in the dark. Above all stories, however, there was one that belonged especially to winter. Far to the north, beyond the black pines and the frozen lakes, beyond the villages where lanterns burned like embers in the snow, there was said to be a palace made of stillness. Not stone, not glass, but stillness itself. In that palace lived the Winter Queen, who wore no crown of gold, only a circlet of white branches touched with frost. It was said that she rode across the sky when the moon was thin, and that wherever she looked too long, warmth forgot the way home. The old people told that tale to frighten the young into coming indoors before dark. Yet the story did not frighten Elin. It made her thoughtful. Rowan, on the other hand, would grin whenever he heard it and lean closer to the window as though he expected to see the Queen's pale carriage passing over the rooftops. "One day," he said during the first heavy snow of that particular winter, "I should like to see something no one else has seen." Elin turned from her candle, which she had shielded with her palm while trimming the wick. "You say that as if it would bring you joy." wouldn't it? She was silent for a moment. Then she looked out at the city, already fading under the evening snow. Not every strange thing is beautiful. Rowan laughed gently, not unkindly, but with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned how sharp wonder could be. Then I shall only look at the beautiful ones. The wind pressed softly at the windows. Somewhere below, a door closed. A cart rolled across the street and was gone. Neither child noticed the shadow crossing the moon. Neither of them saw the brief silver shimmer high above the chimneys, where the dark sky seemed for the smallest instant to crack like thin ice under a hidden footstep. And when the first glittering fragment began its silent fall through the winter air, the little garden above the rooftop still looked like the safest place in the world. Part 2. The Splinter in the Snow. The next morning came bright and white, with the kind of cold that made every rooftop shine as if the city had been carved from salt and pearl in the night. Smoke rose straight from the chimneys. The bells sounded sharper than usual. Even the crows, black as ink against the pale sky, seemed to cry more cautiously in the frozen air. Elin woke early and went at once to the window, as she always did, to check the garden boxes and see whether the winter roses had survived the frost. They had. Each dark leaf held a thin edge of silver, and the buds, though tightly closed, looked steady and brave. She smiled to herself and tapped gently on the window pane between her house and Rowan's. He was not there. That was unusual, though not alarming at first. Rowan often rose early, but he was rarely elsewhere when she came to the window. She wrapped a wool shawl around her shoulders and waited, watching the snowlight brighten the narrow space between the houses. At last she saw him climb the stairs to his room, breathing quickly, his hair full of tiny snow crystals. He pushed open the window a crack at once. "You've been outside already," Elin said. Rowan nodded, his face strangely bright. "The whole square is glazed with ice. Even the fountain has frozen over. You should see it." "At this hour?" she asked. "Before bread? Before tea?" He gave a short laugh. "The morning won't wait for tea." There was nothing rude in the words, yet the sound of them felt unlike him. Elin studied his face more carefully. His cheeks were cold-flushed, and there was a glimmer in his eyes she could not quite name. Not joy. Not exactly. Something harder. Quicker. Like sunlight striking a blade. "You look tired," she said. "I look awake," he answered. Then he leaned farther out, peering not at her but at the flower boxes between them. The blue bells, dried and bowed for winter, trembled lightly in the wind. "These should have been cut back weeks ago," he said. Elin blinked. "What?" "The stems are withered, and the ivy has gone wild along the rail. It looks untidy." For a moment she thought he was joking. Rowan had never cared whether the garden looked orderly. He loved it for its crookedness, for the way mint grew where no one planned it, and pale petals opened unexpectedly in chipped pots. But he was not smiling. "They're sleeping for winter," Elin said quietly. "You know that. They look dead." The words fell between them with a flatness that stung more than if he had shouted. Elin's fingers tightened around her shawl. Below, the city moved slowly into morning. Shop shutters opening. A horse stamping in its traces. A woman sweeping snow from her step. Everything ordinary went on. Yet something in the small space between the windows had changed. "You don't mean that," she said. Rowan gave a little shrug. Perhaps I only see more clearly today. He shut the window before she could answer. Elin stood very still. It was not merely that he had spoken sharply. Children could be sharp from tiredness or cold. It was the way he had looked at the flowers, as if beauty had become an inconvenience to him, as if tenderness were suddenly foolish. That frightened her far more than anger would have done. Later, when the morning chores were finished, she found him in the square near the frozen fountain. A handful of younger boys had gathered there, sliding across the glazed stones in their boots. Rowan was with them, balancing on the edge of the fountain basin where the ice had formed in smooth, glassy layers. He stood easily, arms out, his dark coat open to the wind. "Elin," one of the boys called. "Tell him to get down before he cracks his head." "He won't fall," said another. "He says he can cross the whole edge without looking." Rowan turned at the sound of her name. There was that same bright, cutting light in the expression. "Come home," Elin said. "It's too slippery." "It's only ice," he replied. "That is exactly the problem." One of the boys snorted, but Rowan's mouth curved in a strange half-smile. "You worry too much." "I worry the exact amount required." For the briefest moment, that old warmth almost returned. It flickered in his face like candlelight touched by wind. But then he glanced down at the frozen fountain, and the softness vanished. On the surface of the ice, trapped beneath it, something glittered. Not a coin, not a shard of glass from a broken lantern. This was finer than that, smaller than a fingernail, and yet it caught the winter sun with a cold brilliance that made Elin's breath catch. Rowan crouched at once. "Don't touch it," she said. He looked back at her over his shoulder. "Why not?" Because the air seemed to hold still around it. Because she suddenly remembered the shimmer over the chimneys the night before, though she had not truly seen it, only felt it afterward like a half-forgotten dream. Because some things announced themselves to the heart before the mind understood them. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Just don't." But Rowan pressed his gloved hand against the ice and smiled as if the hidden splinter had whispered to him from under the frost. Part 3. The Mirror of Winter. Rowan did not answer Elin at once. He simply kept his hand resting on the ice, as though listening to something beneath it. The square was quiet that morning. The younger boys had grown bored and wandered away toward the bakery, where the warm smell of bread drifted into the street. A few townspeople crossed the far side of the square, their boots crunching softly in the snow, but no one paid much attention to the frozen fountain. Only Elin stood close enough to see what Rowan had seen. "Step down," she said again, more gently this time. Rowan tilted his head. "There's something here." "It's just ice," she answered, though she could still see the small glitter beneath the surface. "No," he said quietly. "It's something else." He rubbed the frost with the edge of his glove, clearing a narrow circle. The ice was so smooth that it reflected the pale winter sky like a mirror. Beneath it, caught in the frozen water, the tiny fragment shone like a star that had fallen and forgotten how to burn. Elin felt a strange uneasiness. It was too bright, too sharp. Even the sunlight seemed colder where it touched that splinter. "Leave it," she said. Rowan smiled again, but the smile had changed. It had lost the careless warmth she knew so well. Now it looked curious, almost amused. "Why?" "Because it doesn't belong here. That makes it interesting." Before she could say another word, he struck the ice with the heel of his boot. The sound rang out across the square like thin glass cracking. A web of pale lines spread through the frozen surface. Rowan struck again, harder this time. The ice broke with a dull snap, and a small piece lifted free in his hand. Elin took a step forward. "Rowan!" But he was already brushing away the frost. The fragment was smaller than it had seemed beneath the ice, hardly larger than a grain of rice. Yet it shone with a strange, piercing clarity, as if it had been carved from the coldest part of winter itself. "It's nothing," Rowan said lightly. "Then drop it." He laughed. "You're afraid of everything today." "I'm not afraid," Elin replied quietly. "I'm careful." He looked at the glittering speck resting on his glove. For an instant, the winter sun struck it full on. A flash of silver light burst outward, sharp and sudden. Rowan blinked. Then he lifted his hand to his face. "What happened?" Elin asked. "Nothin'," he said quickly, but he rubbed his eye as if something had stung it. "Did it cut you?" "No." He lowered his hand. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary again. The wind moved through the square. Snow slipped softly from the edge of a roof. Somewhere nearby, a door slammed. Yet Elin could not shake the feeling that something unseen had shifted. Rowan tossed the fragment away carelessly. It vanished into the snow at the edge of the fountain. "There," he said. "Gone. Are you sure you're all right?" "Perfectly." He stepped down from the fountain basin and landed easily beside her. Up close, Elin noticed something that made her hesitate. His eyes looked clearer than before. Sharper somehow. As if every small detail of the world had suddenly become brighter and more precise. Rowan glanced around the square. "How strange," he murmured. "What is?" He pointed toward the bakery window across the street. "Look at the frosting on those cakes." Elin followed his gaze. "What about it?" "It's crooked." She blinked. "Crooked?" "Yes," he said thoughtfully. "The baker has tried to make little white roses, but they're uneven. The petals are clumsy." Elin stared at him. Rowan had never cared about such things. If anything, he loved the imperfections of the world. The crooked cakes, the lopsided rooftops, the garden pots tied together with cloth. Now he looked at everything with a kind of cool interest, as though measuring it. "The square is untidy too," he added. "And the fountain carving is badly done." "That carving has been there for 50 years, Elin said. "Then it has been ugly for 50 years. The words were spoken calmly, almost pleasantly, but they felt colder than the wind. Elin searched his face. "Rowan, are you sure your eye doesn't hurt?" "It doesn't hurt," he replied. He smiled again, yet the smile no longer reached his eyes. Those eyes had become bright as winter glass, and somewhere under the snow beside the fountain, the place where the splinter had fallen seemed to glitter faintly, as though the cold itself had begun to wake. Part 4. The first cold wind. That afternoon the sky turned the color of pale tin, and a slow wind began to move through the streets of the city. It was not a violent wind, not the kind that rattled shutters or sent snow swirling wildly across the rooftops. It moved more quietly than that, like a breath passing through narrow corridors. Elin noticed the change at once. Winter had always felt gentle to her city, almost thoughtful, as though the snow arrived with patience and care. But that day the cold seemed sharper, as if something far away had begun to watch. Rowan, however, appeared not to feel it at all. When they returned to their windows above the rooftops, Elin wrapped herself in 2 blankets and lit a candle beside the garden boxes to warm the small space between the panes. Rowan sat opposite her with his window open wider than usual. letting the cold air flow freely into the room. "You'll freeze," she said. "I doubt it." He leaned forward and examined the ivy that climbed the wooden rail between their windows. "You should cut this back," he said. "It's growing well. It's strangling the other plants." Elin touched the ivy leaves gently. "They help keep the wind off the roses." Rowan shook his head. "You're sentimental about plants. And you used to like them." "I used to be bored," he replied. The words were quiet, but they landed strangely. Elin studied his face again. The brightness in his eyes had not faded since the morning. If anything, it had grown sharper. He seemed to see everything more clearly than before, yet that clarity brought no warmth with it. Instead, he watched the garden with an expression that reminded Elin of frost creeping across a window, slow, precise, and quietly destructive. "These flowers are weak," he said after a moment. "They survived the whole winter." "Barely." He reached across the small space between the windows and snapped off a brittle stem from the blue bells. Elin flinched. "Why would you do that?" "It was already dying." "You don't know that." Rowan held the stem between his fingers. The dried petals crumbled easily, falling like dust onto the wooden sill. "It's ugly," he said. Elin felt something twist in her chest. Rowan had always loved broken things. He had once spent an entire afternoon fixing a cracked lantern just because he liked the way the light looked through the imperfect glass. Now he looked at the same world with a strange, cold impatience. "You're different today," she said quietly. "People change. Not in a single morning." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time she felt as if he were studying her the same way he studied the garden, with distance, with judgment. "You worry too much about feelings," Rowan said, "and you used to care about them. They make people foolish." Elin did not answer immediately. Below them, the city moved slowly through the winter afternoon. A horse pulled a cart across the square. Two children chased each other through the snow. From somewhere far away came the faint music of a street violin. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet the space between the two windows felt colder than before. "Do you remember the story about the Winter Queen?" Elin asked softly. Rowan's expression brightened slightly. "The one with the palace of ice?" "Yes. They say she rides across the sky in a carriage made of frost. And wherever she looks," Elin continued, "warmth disappears." Rowan gave a small laugh. "That's only a story." "Perhaps." The wind shifted outside. For a moment it seemed to carry a sound with it, something faint and distant, like the ringing of tiny glass bells. Rowan turned his head slightly, as though he had heard it too. "What was that?" Elin asked. "Nothing." But he kept looking upward. Far above the rooftops, high in the fading winter light, a thin veil of snow began to move across the sky. Not falling, gliding. And for the briefest instant, hidden within that drifting whiteness, something pale and graceful seemed to pass over the city. Something shaped almost like a carriage drawn by silent winds. Elin felt a sudden chill. Rowan, however, was smiling. Part 5. The white carriage. Evening settled over the city slowly, like a soft gray blanket being drawn across the rooftops. Lamps began to glow in the narrow streets, one by one, until small golden pools of light appeared beneath the falling snow. Elin remained by the window long after Rowan had gone from his. The garden between the two houses looked quiet and fragile in the dusk. The winter roses were dark shapes against the pale wood of their boxes, and the ivy moved gently whenever the wind passed through the narrow space between the walls. Usually, evenings like this felt peaceful, but that night something restless stirred in the air. Elin could not say exactly why she felt uneasy. The city looked the same as always. Snow drifted softly from the sky. The distant bells rang the hour. Somewhere nearby, a cat leapt lightly from roof to roof. Yet she kept remembering Rowan's eyes that afternoon. Bright, sharp, colder than the winter itself. She wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and blew out the candle beside the flowers. The room fell into soft darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the street lamps far below. That was when she saw it. At first she thought it was only a reflection in the clouds, a pale shape moving slowly through the snow. Then the wind shifted. The drifting snow parted for a moment, and the shape became clear. High above the rooftops, gliding silently through the winter sky, was a carriage. Not a heavy carriage like those that rolled through the city streets. This one seemed made of frost and moonlight. Its frame shone faintly, as if carved from clear ice, and the runners beneath it glided effortlessly through the air. No horses pulled it. Instead, a wide sweep of snowflakes moved before it, swirling together like a living storm. Elin felt her breath catch. The carriage drifted slowly above the city, almost lazily, as though searching for something. The wind carried a faint sound with it. Not wheels, not bells, something softer, like distant crystal chimes. Elin pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window. The stories came back to her then. Every whispered tale the old people had told during long winter evenings. The stories about the queen who lived in the far northern palace where warmth could never enter. The Winter Queen. She leaned closer to the window, her heart beating faster. Inside the carriage sat a figure dressed in white. Not bright white like fresh snow under sunlight. Colder than that. The kind of white that belongs to frost on iron or moonlight on frozen lakes. The figure didn't move. Yet Elin felt with sudden certainty that those pale eyes were looking down over the rooftops of the city. Looking. Choosing. At that exact moment, a window opened across the garden. Rowan leaned out into the night air. "Elin," he said quietly. His voice sounded almost excited. "Do you see it?" She turned toward him quickly. "Yes." Rowan's gaze was fixed on the sky. For the first time that day, his face held something close to wonder. But it was not the warm wonder she remembered from their childhood. This was a colder fascination. "She's beautiful," he murmured. Elin felt a sudden ripple of fear. "You shouldn't say that." "Why not?" "Because she's not part of our world." Rowan laughed softly. "Everything is part of our world if we can see it." The carriage glided lower. Snow swirled in wide, silent circles around it. For one long moment, the pale figure inside turned slightly. The movement was small, almost delicate, but Rowan leaned farther out of the window as though drawn forward by an invisible thread. "Elin," he whispered. "Yes?" "I think..." His voice grew softer. "I think she's looking at me." The wind rose suddenly. Snow rushed through the narrow space between the houses, scattering across the wooden garden boxes. The winter roses trembled, and high above the rooftops the white carriage slowed, as if it had finally found what it had been searching for. Part 6. The night of frost. For a long moment neither Elin nor Rowan spoke. The white carriage drifted silently above the rooftops, moving so smoothly that it seemed less like something traveling through the air and more like a thought passing across the sky. Snow followed it in slow spirals. The pale figure inside the carriage did not move again, yet the stillness itself felt powerful, like the quiet center of a winter storm. "Elin," Rowan said softly. "Yes?" "She really is beautiful." Elin felt a shiver pass through her. "Beauty isn't always safe." Rowan didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the sky. The carriage glided closer, not low enough to touch the rooftops, but near enough now that the pale glow surrounding it reflected faintly in the windows of the narrow houses. For the briefest moment, the drifting snow parted again. Elin saw the figure clearly. The Winter Queen looked almost human at first glance. Her face was calm, pale, and perfectly still, like a sculpture carved from ice. Long white hair fell around her shoulders like threads of frost, but it was her eyes that made Ellen's breath stop. They were not cruel. They were not angry. They were simply cold. Cold in a way that did not belong to weather, but to something much older and deeper than winter itself. The queen lifted one hand. The motion was slow, graceful. Snow responded immediately. Thousands of tiny flakes gathered together in the air before the carriage, swirling into delicate shapes that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Rowan leaned farther out the window. "Do you see that?" he whispered. "Yes," Elin said. Her voice was tight with unease. "Come back inside." "Why?" "The wind is getting stronger." But Rowan did not move. The snowflakes spinning before the carriage had begun to form patterns. Perfect patterns. Sharp angles. Bright crystalline stars. They hover in the air like living frost. One of them drifted downward. Slowly. Gracefully. Elin felt her heart begin to beat faster. "Rowan," she said again. But he reached his hand out into the cold night air. The falling snowflake landed lightly on his glove. For a moment nothing happened. Then the delicate shape dissolved into a shimmer of frost. Rowan stared at the spot where it had rested. His smile widened. "It's like glass," he said quietly. "Elin, look how perfect it was." The carriage began to move again, higher now. The swirling snow thinned until only a pale mist remained behind it. Soon the white shape faded into the clouds, and the sky above the rooftops returned to ordinary darkness. The wind softened. Silence returned to the narrow space between the two houses. Rowan slowly withdrew his hand. "Well," he said lightly. "That was interesting." Elin searched his face. "Are you all right?" "Of course." "Your eyes, what about them?" She hesitated. "They look different." Rowan laughed softly. "You've said that 3 times today." "Because it's true." He brushed a few snow crystals from his sleeve. "The night air is making you imagine things." Elin wanted to argue, but something in his expression stopped her. He looked calm. Perfectly calm. Too calm. The sharp brightness in his eyes had deepened into something even colder. Something clear and distant, like a frozen lake under moonlight. "I'm tired," Rowan said. "I think I'll sleep." He closed the window. The small garden between the houses fell quiet again. Elin remained where she was. Snow continued to drift softly across the rooftops. Nothing else moved in the sky. Yet the memory of the pale queen and her silent carriage lingered in the air like frost that refused to melt. And somewhere deep inside Rowan's heart, where warmth had once lived easily, the cold had begun to grow. Very slowly, very quietly, but with the patience of winter itself. Part 7. The broken garden. Morning came pale and quiet. A thin layer of frost had settled across the rooftops during the night, covering the city in a delicate silver glow. The streets below were still half asleep, and the only sounds drifting upward were the distant creak of a cartwheel and the quiet sweep of a broom against stone. Elin woke later than usual. The strange events of the night had followed her into uneasy dreams, and for several moments after opening her eyes, she lay still beneath her blankets, trying to remember whether the white carriage had truly been real. Then she remembered Rowan's face, the brightness in his eyes, the way he had looked at the snowflake resting on his glove. She rose quickly and crossed the room to the window. The garden between the two houses was still there, just as it had always been. Wooden boxes lined carefully along the narrow rail, ivy climbing patiently around the post, and the winter roses standing dark and stubborn against the frost. But something was wrong. The blue bells were gone. At first, Elin thought the wind must have broken them during the night. Then she noticed the stems. They had not been broken. They had been cut. The pieces lay scattered across the wooden boards like small fallen feathers. Elin felt a sudden knot form in her chest. She tapped lightly on the window. No answer. She tapped again. This time Rowan appeared. He opened his window immediately, letting a sharp gust of cold air rush into the space between the houses. "Good morning," he said. His voice sounded calm. Too calm. "Elin," he added, "you're awake later than usual." She pointed at the garden. "What happened?" Rowan glanced down. "Oh," he said, "I cleared them." "You cleared them?" "Yes." His tone carried no apology. "They were dead." "They weren't dead. They looked dead." Elin stared at him. "You loved those flowers." Rowan leaned against the window frame. "I loved the idea of them." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said thoughtfully, "that they weren't as beautiful as I remembered." The words felt colder than the frost covering the rooftops. Elin shook her head slowly. "Flowers aren't meant to be perfect." "Why not?" "Because they're alive." Rowan smiled faintly. "Exactly." He reached down and snapped another thin branch of ivy that had been climbing along the wooden rail. It broke with a dry crack. Elin flinched. "Stop doing that." "It's messy. Nature is messy. That's the problem." His eyes drifted across the garden again. "This whole place is cluttered." Elin could hardly believe what she was hearing. This tiny rooftop garden had once been Rowan's favorite place in the world. He had planted half the herbs himself. He had named the winter roses. He had once spent an entire afternoon carefully tying broken stems upright with thin thread so they could grow straight again. Now he looked at the same garden with quiet dissatisfaction. "You're acting strange," she said. "Or maybe," Rowan replied calmly, "I'm seeing clearly for the first time." The wind moved through the narrow space between the houses. A few loose leaves from the ivy drifted down into the street below. Elin watched them fall. Something inside her felt like it was falling too. "Rowan," she said quietly. "Yes?" "Do you remember the stories we used to tell here?" "Of course. About the forests, the rivers under ice, the birds that knew the road to summer." He nodded. "I remember." "And the Winter Queen?" Rowan's smile returned. This time it looked almost pleased. "She was magnificent." Elin felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You shouldn't admire her." "Why not?" "Because she takes warmth away from things." Rowan looked at the broken stems scattered across the boards. "Warmth makes people careless." Elin felt her throat tighten. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city below had fully awakened now. Voices echoed faintly between the buildings. Somewhere a baker's bell rang as the first customers entered the shop. Life continued exactly as always. Yet the small garden above the rooftops no longer felt like a place of safety. Rowan picked up the last fragile stem of a bluebell and turned it thoughtfully in his fingers. Then he let it fall. "It was never beautiful," he said. And for the first time since Elin had known him, his voice held no warmth at all. Part 8. The Sledge on the Snow. The winter days that followed grew colder. Not suddenly, not with a storm or a fierce wind, but slowly, the way frost spreads across a window during the night, quietly and with great patience. The sky remained pale for hours each day, and the sun, when it appeared, seemed distant and tired. Elin noticed the change in Rowan long before anyone else did. To the people in the streets, he still looked like the same cheerful boy. He spoke politely, helped carry baskets from the market, and laughed easily with the other children when they raced across the snowy square. But Elin saw the difference. She saw it in the way he looked at things now. Before, Rowan had always noticed the warmth in the world, the glow of lamplight through windows, the smell of bread drifting from bakeries, the quiet comfort of sitting close to the garden between their houses while the snow fell softly outside. Now his gaze lingered on other things. Sharp things, cold things, perfect things. The cracks in the stone fountain fascinated him. The delicate patterns frost made on the iron gates of the square held his attention for long minutes at a time. Sometimes he even traced those patterns with his finger, as if studying their shape. "It's beautiful," he said once, examining a thin sheet of ice stretched across a puddle. "It will melt," Elin replied. "That's unfortunate." She frowned. "Why?" "Because perfection should last longer." Elin had no answer for that. The other children had begun gathering in the square each afternoon, sliding across the frozen stones on small wooden sledges. Laughter filled the air as they pushed one another along the icy paths and raced from one end of the square to the other. Rowan joined them often, but he played differently now. Where the others shouted and tumbled into the snow, Rowan moved carefully and with remarkable balance. His sledge glided across the ice with smooth, precise movements, as if he understood the frozen ground in a way the others did not. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the rooftops, Rowan stood at the far end of the square, holding the rope of his sledge. Elin watched from the steps of the fountain. A new carriage had entered the street. It was not like the pale carriage that had passed through the sky days before. This one was ordinary, large and dark, pulled by 2 strong horses. Snow clung to its wheels as it rolled slowly through the square. The other children barely noticed it, but Rowan did. His eyes followed the carriage carefully. Then, without hesitation, he tied the rope of his small sledge to the back of it. "Elin!" one of the boys shouted. "Look what he's doing!" "Rowan!" she called. "Don't!" But he only grinned. "It will be faster." The horses began to move. The carriage rolled forward, and Rowan's sledge shot across the frozen square behind it. The wind rushed past his face as the speed increased. Snow sprayed beneath the runners of the sledge, and the rope pulled tight as the carriage turned down the street, leading away from the square. The other children cheered, but Elin felt a strange unease. Something about the moment felt wrong. The carriage did not stop at the end of the street as most did. Instead, it continued moving. Faster, farther, Rowan's sledge followed behind it, sliding easily across the packed snow. "Elin," one of the boys said suddenly, his voice uncertain. "Where is he going?" She stood quickly. The carriage had reached the far edge of the street now. Snow drifted across the road ahead of it, and for a brief moment, as the fading winter light touched the roof of the carriage, Elin thought she saw something impossible. The snow around it began to swirl, not from the horses, not from the wind, but as if the air itself had begun to follow the carriage. The rope pulling Rowan's sledge tightened further. The horses moved faster. The carriage rolled out of the square, and Rowan disappeared with it into the falling snow. Elin felt her heart drop, because deep inside, she knew something the others did not yet understand. That carriage had not come by accident, and the cold had just taken its first real step into Rowan's life. Part 9. The Vanishing Road. For a few seconds after Rowan disappeared into the snowy street, the square remained strangely quiet. The other children stood still, watching the place where the carriage had vanished. One boy laughed nervously and kicked at the ice beneath his boots. "He'll be back in a minute," he said. "He's done that before." But Elin did not believe it. She had watched the snow swirling behind that carriage. It had not moved like ordinary wind. It had followed. Without waiting for another word, she ran. Her boots slipped on the frozen stones as she crossed the square and hurried into the narrow street where the carriage had gone. Snow drifted softly through the air, and the evening light had already begun to fade between the tall buildings. "Elin," someone called behind her. But she did not stop. The street stretched ahead in a long white path between dark walls of stone. The tracks of the carriage wheels were still visible in the snow, deep and clear, and beside them, the thin sliding line of Rowan's sledge. Relief flickered briefly inside her. At least she knew which way he had gone. She followed the tracks quickly, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. The houses grew farther apart as she ran, and soon the narrow city streets opened into the road, leading out toward the frozen fields beyond the town. The wind grew stronger there. Snow moved across the road in long, sweeping ribbons. The carriage tracks continued straight ahead. Elin slowed for a moment, trying to catch her breath. "Rowan," she called. Her voice disappeared into the wind. No answer came back. She kept walking. The road curved gently past the last houses of the city. Lanterns glowed faintly behind frosted windows, but the fields beyond were already dim with approaching night. The tracks in the snow began to look strange. They were still there, but they were changing. The deep marks from the carriage wheels had grown lighter, as though the weight of the carriage had slowly disappeared. And the line from Rowan's sledge, that line was fading. Elin knelt down beside it. Her gloved fingers brushed across the snow. The track ended, not gradually, not slowly, simply gone, as if the sledge had been lifted straight into the air. A cold feeling spread through her chest. She stood slowly and looked up. The road ahead was empty. No horses, no carriage, no Rowan. Only the pale winter sky stretching above the silent fields. "Elin." The voice came from behind her. She turned quickly. An old woman stood at the edge of the road, wrapped in a heavy gray cloak. Snow clung to the folds of the fabric, and her eyes were calm and steady beneath the hood. "You shouldn't walk so far out here alone," the woman said gently. Elin hesitated. "Did you see a carriage pass this way?" The woman studied the empty road. "Perhaps. There was a boy behind it on a sledge. The old woman's gaze softened slightly. Yes, she said after a moment. I believe I saw him. Elin stepped forward quickly. Where did he go? The woman lifted one thin hand and pointed toward the darkening sky. Elin followed the gesture. At first she saw nothing but drifting snow. Then, high above the silent winter fields, a pale shimmer moved through the clouds. For just a moment the shape of a carriage appeared, gliding silently through the sky. Snow followed it like a trailing veil. Elin's heart began to race. That's impossible, she whispered. The old woman's voice remained calm. Not in winter. But Rowan, he went with her. With who? The old woman's eyes reflected the pale sky. The one who rides the cold wind. Elin felt the truth of it before the words were even finished. The Winter Queen, she breathed. The old woman nodded slowly. The wind moved across the fields again. Snow drifted between them like quiet falling feathers. Elin stared upward at the fading shape in the sky. Rowan was gone. And somewhere far beyond the frozen forests of the north, the Winter Queen was carrying him away into a world where warmth could not follow. Part 10. The Promise. Elin stood in the road long after the pale carriage had disappeared into the clouds. The sky slowly returned to its ordinary winter gray. Snow drifted quietly over the empty fields, and the wind whispered across the frozen ground, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But everything had changed. Rowan was gone. The old woman beside the road watched Elin carefully. You should return home, she said gently. Night is coming. Elin did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the place where the carriage had vanished. Can I reach him? She asked. The woman was silent for a moment. The north is very far. I didn't ask if it was easy. The old woman's gaze softened. No, she said quietly. You didn't. Elin finally turned toward her. You said the one who rides the cold wind took him. Yes. Then I will follow. The woman studied her face as if measuring the strength of something she could not see. Many people speak brave words when the road is still short, she said. But winter roads are long. Elin wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Rowan would have followed me. The old woman's eyes brightened faintly. That may be true. Snow continued to fall in soft, patient flakes. The road leading back toward the city glowed faintly in the distance where lanterns had begun to appear in the windows. Warm light flickered there. Homes, kitchens, quiet rooms where people were already gathering for the evening. Elin looked toward that warmth. Then she looked north. Beyond the fields, dark forests stretched across the horizon like sleeping shadows. Do you know the way? The woman asked. No. Do you know how far the north reaches? No. Do you know what waits there? Elin shook her head, but her voice did not tremble. I know Rowan is there. The old woman smiled slightly. Sometimes that is enough. She stepped closer and adjusted the scarf around Elin's shoulders, pulling it tighter against the cold wind. You must begin in the morning, the woman said. Why not tonight? Because journeys made in fear often lose their direction. Elin hesitated. What if she takes him farther while I wait? The woman's voice was calm. The north moves slowly. Winter has patience. She turned and began walking back toward the city road. Elin followed a few steps behind. The lantern lights grew brighter as they approached the houses. Smoke drifted gently from the chimneys, carrying the familiar smell of wood fires and warm kitchens. Ordinary life. The kind Rowan had once loved. At the edge of the street, the old woman stopped. You must sleep tonight, she said. And tomorrow? Tomorrow you begin walking. Elin nodded. She looked up at the sky once more. The clouds moved slowly across the moon, pale and quiet. Somewhere beyond them, far beyond the forests and frozen lakes of the north, a palace of ice waited in endless winter. And Rowan was there. "I will find him," she said softly. The old woman did not laugh. Instead, she placed one hand gently over Elin's. "Then promise yourself something." "What?" "Do not let the cold enter your heart the way it entered his." Elin closed her fingers tightly. "I promise." The old woman nodded once. "Good." Then she stepped away into the snowy street and disappeared between the lantern-lit houses. Elin remained there for a long time, listening to the quiet sound of falling snow. Tomorrow the journey would begin, and the road ahead would lead farther than she had ever imagined. North. Always north. Toward the palace where winter never ended. Part 11. The river that remembers. Morning arrived quietly. Snow had fallen through the night, covering the city in a fresh white silence. The rooftops looked softer now, and the streets seemed calmer than usual, as if the world itself had paused for a moment before beginning the day again. Elin woke before the bells rang. For a few seconds she lay still beneath her blanket, listening to the soft hush outside the window. The promise she had made the night before returned to her at once. Rowan was somewhere in the north, and she would follow. She dressed quickly, wrapping herself in her thickest coat and tying her scarf tightly around her neck. Before leaving, she crossed the room and looked once more at the small garden between the two windows. The broken stems of the bluebells still lay scattered across the wooden boards. A thin layer of snow had covered them during the night. The winter roses, however, still stood, quiet, patient, alive. Elin touched one of the dark leaves gently through the open window. "I'll come back," she whispered. Then she closed the window and stepped out into the morning. The city was only beginning to wake. A baker carried baskets of bread into his shop, and a woman swept fresh snow from the stone steps outside her door. The air smelled faintly of smoke and warm flour. Elin walked past the square without stopping. The frozen fountain glimmered pale in the early light. For a moment she thought she saw Rowan standing there again, balancing easily on the edge of the ice as he had only days before. But the square was empty. The road leading north waited beyond the last houses of the city. Elin followed it. At first, the path moved through quiet fields where fences and small barns rose from the snow like dark islands. The wind brushed gently across the open land, carrying tiny clouds of powdery snow along the ground. After some time, the fields gave way to a narrow forest road. Tall pines stood on either side, their branches heavy with white. The air inside the forest felt softer somehow, quieter than the open fields behind her. Elin walked steadily. She did not know how far she would need to go, or how many days the journey might take. But she knew the direction. North. The path curved gently through the trees until, at last, the forest opened onto a wide river. It flowed slowly beneath a thin crust of ice, the dark water moving quietly below the frozen surface. Snow had gathered along the banks, and small reed poked through the white like delicate fingers. Elin stopped at the edge of the river. For the first time since leaving the city, uncertainty touched her. The road ended here. The river stretched across her path, wide and silent. She knelt down beside the frozen edge and touched the ice carefully. It was too thin to walk across. "What should I do?" she murmured softly. The river continued flowing, whispering gently beneath the ice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small ripple moved through the water near the bank. Elin leaned closer. Something silver flashed just beneath the surface. A fish appeared, gliding slowly through the dark water. Its scales caught the pale morning light, shining faintly like tiny pieces of glass. It paused near the edge of the ice, looking upward. Elin blinked. For a strange moment, she felt as though the creature were studying her. "Hello," she said quietly. The fish turned once in the water. Then another appeared beside it. And another. Soon a small circle of silver shapes moved beneath the thin ice, their quiet motion sending gentle patterns across the frozen surface. Elin felt a sudden warmth in her chest. It was the first kind presence she had encountered since leaving the city. "I'm trying to find someone," she said softly. The fish continued circling slowly. "The Winter Queen took him north," Elin continued. "Do you know the way?" For a moment the water remained still. Then the fish began moving together in a smooth silver line, swimming toward the center of the river. They paused there, directly opposite Elin on the far bank. She followed their movement with her eyes. The ice there looked thicker, stronger, a narrow crossing where the frozen river might hold her weight. Elin stood slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. The fish flickered once more beneath the water, their scales flashing softly in the pale light. Then they disappeared into the dark current. Elin stepped carefully onto the ice. The river groaned quietly beneath her boots, but it held. One step, then another. The journey north had truly begun. And somewhere far ahead, beyond the forests and frozen lakes, Rowan waited in the palace of endless winter. Part 12. The Garden of Forgotten Summers. The ice held. Elin crossed the river slowly, listening carefully to every small sound beneath her boots. The frozen surface creaked once or twice, but the thick white layer did not break. Soon she stepped safely onto the far bank. The forest ahead looked darker than the one she had left behind. Tall trees stood close together there, their branches heavy with snow. The path between them was narrow, winding gently deeper into the quiet woods. Elin paused for a moment and looked back. The river shimmered faintly behind her, and the city she had left that morning was already far beyond the horizon. There was no turning back now. She adjusted her scarf and continued north. The forest air smelled sharp and clean. Snow softened every sound, so that even Elin's footsteps seemed quiet and distant. Occasionally a bird fluttered between the branches, shaking loose tiny showers of powdery snow that drifted down like white feathers. After walking for what felt like many hours, the trees began to change. The dark pines grew thinner. In their place appeared strange flowering bushes that should not have existed in winter. Elin stopped in surprise. Small yellow blossoms covered the branches ahead, bright summer flowers in the middle of winter. She stepped closer. The air here felt warmer. Not hot, just gently warm, like the first mild day of spring after a long cold season. Snow no longer covered the ground. Instead, soft green grass grew beneath the trees. Elin looked around in quiet wonder. "How can this be?" she whispered. A narrow stone path appeared between the bushes, leading toward a small wooden gate. Beyond it, she could see something even stranger. A garden. Not a winter garden like the one between the rooftops of her home. This garden was full of life. Roses climbed wooden arches. Bright flowers filled the beds beside the path, bees drifted lazily through the warm air, and somewhere nearby a small fountain trickled gently over smooth stones. Elin stepped through the gate slowly. For a moment she forgot about the cold journey behind her, forgot about the long road still waiting ahead. The garden felt peaceful, safe, almost like a dream of summer. "Hello?" she called softly. The sound of gentle footsteps answered from behind one of the rose bushes. An old woman appeared. Her hair was long and silver, tied loosely at the back of her neck. She wore a deep green cloak that brushed the grass as she walked, and her eyes were bright and curious. "Well," the woman said with a warm smile, "what a surprise." Elin bowed her head politely. "I'm sorry if I entered without asking." "Nonsense," the woman replied cheerfully. "Gardens are meant to welcome travelers." Her gaze moved thoughtfully across Elin's coat and snow-covered boots. "You've come a long way." "I'm still going farther," Elin said. "Is that so?" The woman gestured toward a wooden bench near the fountain. "You must be tired. Sit for a moment." Elin hesitated. She remembered the promise she had made. Do not let the cold enter your heart. But she had also been warned that winter journeys were long. A short rest would not change her path. She sat carefully on the bench. Warm sunlight filtered through the branches above, and the soft sound of flowing water filled the garden with gentle calm. The old woman poured tea from a small clay pot and handed Elin a cup. "You're traveling north," she said. Elin looked up quickly. "How did you know?" The woman smiled kindly. "People who walk north in winter are always searching for something." Elin wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "The Winter Queen took someone I care about." The woman's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. "Did she?" "Yes." "And you plan to follow her?" Elin nodded firmly. "I promised." The woman watched her for a long moment. Then she sighed softly. "You are very brave." "I don't feel brave," Elin admitted. "I just can't stop." The woman smiled again, but this time the expression carried a hint of something deeper. "Perhaps you should stay here for a while," she said gently. "This garden is warm, safe. There's always food and sunshine." Elin looked around. The roses swayed softly in the breeze. Birds sang from the branches above. The peaceful garden felt like the opposite of everything waiting in the frozen north. For a moment, the thought of staying was very tempting, but Rowan's face returned to her mind at once. Bright, cold, alone in a palace of ice. Elin set the teacup down. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I can't stay." The old woman's smile faded just slightly. "We'll see," she murmured. And somewhere deep within the beautiful garden, hidden beneath the warm sunlight and blooming flowers, something ancient and patient stirred. Part 13. The garden that tries to hold you. Elin remained in the garden longer than she intended. At first, it was only a short rest. The warm tea softened the cold in her hands, and the gentle sunlight made the long journey through the snowy forest feel like something far away. The old woman spoke kindly, asking simple questions about the city Elin had left behind. "Was it a beautiful place?" she asked while trimming a rose branch with careful hands. "Yes," Elin said, "especially in winter." "In winter?" the woman smiled. "Most people prefer summer." Elin watched the fountain water moving softly over the stones. "Winter feels honest," she replied quietly. The woman nodded thoughtfully. They walked slowly through the garden paths together. Everywhere Elin looked, there were colors she had not seen since the warm months of the year. Golden flowers, red berries, pale pink roses opening toward the sun. Birds fluttered from branch to branch above them. The air smelled sweet and green. It felt impossible that snow and frozen forests existed only a short distance away. "You must stay for supper," the woman said gently. "I shouldn't. It will be dark soon." Elin looked toward the sky. The sunlight had begun to fade slightly behind the tall trees. Perhaps a few more minutes would not hurt. They sat beside the fountain while the woman brought bread, honey, and warm soup from a small cottage hidden behind the roses. Elin ate gratefully. The warmth spread through her body like sunlight. For the first time since leaving the city, the tight feeling in her chest began to loosen. "You see," the woman said softly, "you are safe here." Elin smiled faintly. "Yes, it's very peaceful." The woman studied her face. "And the north is not peaceful." "No. Then why go there?" Elin hesitated. For a moment her thoughts felt strangely slow, as though they were drifting through warm summer air instead of cold winter wind. Why was she going north? The garden was beautiful. The journey had already been long. Perhaps Rowan had already forgotten her. Perhaps... Elin blinked suddenly. A memory rose sharply in her mind. The rooftop garden, the broken stems of the bluebells, Rowan's eyes, bright and cold like frozen glass. She sat up straight. "I have to leave." The old woman tilted her head slightly. "So soon?" "Yes. You're still tired." "I'll rest later." The woman's smile faded just a little. "You might forget the way." "I won't." Many travelers do. The air in the garden felt heavier now. The birds had grown strangely quiet. Even the fountain seemed to whisper more softly than before. Elin stood. "I promised someone," she said firmly. The old woman watched her for a long moment. Then she sighed. "Very well." She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small silver comb decorated with delicate flowers. "Take this," she said. Elin hesitated. "I can't accept gifts." "It isn't a gift." "What is it?" "A reminder." Elin took the comb carefully. It felt cool in her hand, almost like ice. "Why would I need a reminder?" she asked. The woman's eyes sparkled faintly. "Because sometimes gardens try to make people forget the road." Elin looked around again. For a moment she thought she saw the roses leaning slightly toward her, their petals opening wider as though inviting her to stay. A small shiver ran through her. "Thank you," she said. The old woman walked with her to the gate. The warm grass ended suddenly there. Beyond the wooden arch, the forest returned to winter. Snow covered the ground again. Cold wind moved through the trees. Elin stepped through the gate. When she turned back to thank the woman once more, the garden was gone. Only snow-covered forest stood behind her. No roses, no fountain, no cottage. Just silent trees and drifting winter air. Elin stared for a moment in astonishment. Then she slipped the silver comb into her pocket and continued walking north. The journey had become more dangerous, but she had not forgotten why she began it. And somewhere far ahead, beyond the frozen forests and endless snowfields, the palace of the Winter Queen waited. Part 14. The Ravens of the North. The forest grew quieter as Elin continued her journey. The trees stood closer together here, tall and dark against the pale sky. Snow covered every branch and root, softening the shapes of the forest until the whole world seemed made of white and shadow. Elin walked for many hours. Sometimes the wind moved gently through the pines, sending faint whispers through the frozen needles. Other times the air was so still that even her own breathing sounded loud in the silence. The silver comb rested safely in her pocket. She did not fully understand why the strange garden had given it to her, but somehow the small object made her feel less alone. As the afternoon slowly faded, the forest began to thin again. Ahead of her rose a tall hill of dark stone. At its peak stood the broken remains of what had once been an old watchtower. Snow clung to the cracked walls, and the narrow windows looked out across the endless white forests of the north. Elin climbed the hill slowly. The wind was stronger there. From the top she could see far beyond the trees, frozen lakes shining like pale mirrors in the distance, and mountain ridges stretching across the horizon. The north was vast, much larger than she'd imagined. For the first time since leaving the city, a quiet doubt touched her heart. How could she find Rowan in a land so wide? A sudden sound broke the silence. Caw. Elin turned. Two large ravens sat on the broken stone wall of the tower, their black feathers shining faintly against the snow. They watched her carefully. "Hello," Elin said softly. The larger raven tilted its head. "Hello yourself," it croaked. Elin blinked. She had not expected an answer. The second raven hopped closer along the stone. "You are far from home," it said. Elin stared at them in amazement. "You can talk." "Of course we can talk," the first raven replied. "The real question is why you are wandering into the coldest part of the world alone." "I'm looking for someone," Elin said. "Everyone is always looking for someone," the second raven muttered. "The Winter Queen took him," Elin continued. "She carried him north in her carriage." The two ravens exchanged a glance. "That sounds familiar," said the first one slowly. "Very familiar," agreed the other. Elin stepped closer. "You know where she lives?" The ravens hopped along the wall again, their claws scratching softly against the frozen stone. "The Ice Palace," said the larger bird. "Very impressive place," the other added. "Cold floors, cold walls, cold heart." "Where is it?" Elin asked quickly. The ravens both looked toward the distant mountains. "Farther north than most travelers ever go," said the first. "Beyond the frozen lakes," said the second. "And beyond the glass forest," added the first. Elin frowned. "The glass forest?" "A place where every tree is made of ice," the raven explained. "Beautiful, but dangerous. And the palace stands in the middle of it," the second raven finished. Elin felt a quiet determination rise inside her again. "Then that's where I'm going." The raven studied her carefully. "You are very small," one of them said. "The north is very large," said the other. "I know." They flapped their wings once, sending small clouds of snow drifting into the air. Finally, the larger raven spoke again. "We could help you." "You could?" Elin asked. "Not by carrying you," the bird said quickly. "You're far too heavy for that." "But we can guide you," the second raven added. "We know the safe paths between the frozen lakes." Elin smiled for the first time in many days. "I would be grateful." The ravens spread their wings. "Then follow," said the first. "We travel at dawn," said the second. They lifted into the evening sky together, circling once above the broken tower before disappearing toward the northern mountains. Elin watched them go. For the first time since the journey began, the path ahead felt a little clearer. But she also knew something else. The ice palace of the Winter Queen was closer now, and Rowan was waiting inside it, waiting in a world where warmth could not easily survive. Part 15. The Palace of Ice. Dawn came pale and quiet over the northern mountains. The ravens returned just as the first thin light touched the snow. Their black wings cut through the cold morning air as they circled once above the hill where Elin had slept beside the broken tower. "You're still here," croaked the larger one. "Of course she is," said the other. "She promised." Elin stood and brushed the frost from her coat. "I'm ready." "Good," said the first raven, "because the north doesn't like to wait." They lifted into the air, gliding slowly ahead while Elin followed the narrow path between the frozen hills. The land grew stranger as they traveled. Soon the trees disappeared completely. In their place stretched wide frozen lakes that shone like dull silver mirrors beneath the pale sky. The wind swept across them in long, quiet sighs, carrying small clouds of drifting snow across the ice. The ravens guided her carefully around the edges. "Never walk across the middle," one warned. "The ice there remembers the deep water beneath." They traveled all morning. By midday, the mountains grew closer, rising like dark blue shadows against the horizon. Then Elin saw it. At first, she thought the mountains themselves were shining. But as she climbed the final ridge, the truth appeared. A forest stood ahead. Every tree was made of ice. Thousands of pale trunks rose from the frozen ground, their branches glittering faintly like crystal in the cold sunlight. The entire forest shimmered softly, as though the air itself had turned to glass. "The glass forest," said one of the ravens quietly. Elin stepped closer. The frozen branches chimed faintly when the wind passed through them, filling the silent landscape with delicate ringing sounds. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's also sharp," the raven replied. "Walk carefully." They moved slowly through the shining forest. Every step made a soft crunch on the frozen ground. The ice trees reflected the pale light in endless patterns, turning the forest into a maze of shimmering shapes. At the far end of the forest, something even brighter rose against the sky. The Ice Palace. It stood on a wide frozen plain, its towers rising like pale blue flames into the cold air. The walls were smooth and shining, built entirely from ice that never melted. Snow swirled gently around the palace gates. The ravens landed beside Elin. "That's as far as we go," one said. "The rest is your story," said the other. Elin nodded. "Thank you." She walked forward alone. The great doors of the palace were open. Inside, the air was perfectly still. The floors were made of polished ice, reflecting the pale light that filtered through tall, frozen windows. Everything inside the palace looked precise and silent, like a world carved from winter itself. At the center of the hall sat Rowan. He knelt on the ice floor, surrounded by scattered pieces of crystal that looked like fragments of a broken mirror. His face was calm. His eyes were bright and cold. "Elin," he said quietly when he saw her. "You came." She stepped toward him. "Of course I did." Rowan looked down at the crystal pieces again. "I've almost solved it," he said. "Solved what?" "The pattern." He moved one of the pieces slightly. "They say if I arrange them perfectly, I'll understand everything." Elin knelt beside him. His hands felt cold when she touched them. "Rowan," she said softly. He looked at her. For a moment, the bright, glass-like cold in his eyes did not change. Then Elin felt tears forming. Not loud sobs. Just quiet tears that slipped down her face and fell gently onto the frozen floor between them. One drop landed on Rowan's hand, warm. He blinked. Another tear followed. The warmth spread slowly across the ice where it touched. Rowan's expression changed. The sharp brightness in his eyes flickered. "Elin," he whispered. The cold in his gaze cracked like thin ice under sunlight. Memories returned. Soft winter evenings, the rooftop garden, the crooked flowers growing in their wooden boxes. "You came all this way," he said quietly. "Yes." "Why?" Elin smiled gently. "Because you're my friend." The last piece of frost inside Rowan's heart melted. The crystal fragments scattered across the floor suddenly lost their perfect shape, sliding quietly across the ice. The palace walls trembled softly as if winter itself had sighed. Far above the frozen towers, the wind began to change. Snow started falling again, but now it looked softer, warmer somehow, like the first snow of a gentle winter evening. Rowan stood slowly. His eyes were no longer sharp like glass. They were simply Rowan's again. "Let's go home," he said. Elin nodded. Together they walked out of the palace, leaving the endless winter behind them, and far away, above the rooftops of their small northern city, the little garden between the two windows waited patiently for spring.